Hey everyone, this is the SIG-Auth meeting for February 2nd, 2022. That's more stuff in the agenda than I last remember. It still seems kind of light, but let's get started. Who added the kubectl command to request down? Oh, that was Jordan, I think. Jordan, I think you made that PR. Do you want to talk about it?
Yep. I ran across this when I was thinking through what we were going to do this release for the balance service account token stuff and looking at how people were actually scraping auto-generated tokens, and thought we should give them a nice way to get a token the way we want them to. So I think I will actually relocate this to kubecontrol create. I forgot we have a bunch of creation commands under there. So kubecontrol create token or create service account token. That way, by default, it can create the token and print out the token, or you can like output the JSON blob back and pull out things like expiration timestamp or any information you want from the resulting object. So it's just an FYI.
All right, cool. That's fun. Useful. Trying to think.
Really quick question there. I'll review the PR, but just directionally, are you thinking about like also adding flags for all the fields on the API, like audience and expiration time and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you could say create it for this service account. By default, you just get the same thing as submitting an empty token request. So default expiration, default audiences, but yes, customize expiration and customize audiences. And I even tried to warn if you ask for a custom expiration and you get back something that looks like it didn't honor your expiration. I can't fail because of client clock skew, but I can print a warning. So
the token request API doesn't ever emit server-side warnings, right? There isn't any case that we emit a server-side warning.
We're not today. That's a good point. Yeah, we're not today. That's a good point, though. Let me think about whether we want to do a server-side warning instead of a client-side warning.
Okay. Yeah, I recently integrated server-side warnings downstream, and I'm like, warn about everything all the time. Just every random thing, just warn. It's fine. Who cares? At least the client has some big idea of what happened.
It's a careful line you got to walk. If you warn about everything, then no one will pay attention to any of your warnings.
That's true.
But yes, it's a good tool.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's pretty cool. All right. Does anyone else have any comments on this topic? Cool. All right, we'll move forward. So the next thing, I think this is basically ready. I don't know, Nish, if you had a chance to update based on David's feedback, which was basically don't be bad with the feature gates, which is fine, totally fine.
Yeah, I just pushed the commit to update it.
Are we, all right, so it's gonna be alpha. Okay, I was gonna ask, does anyone else want to take a look at it? And I think David basically said just fix the feature gate stuff and we're good from PRR. I don't think Clayton ever looked at it, and I'm not sure if he's going to. So just, I've looked at it. It's fine. It's about as small. I mean, David and I have looked at it. It's about as, and Rita too. It's about as small as you can have in PR for this or proposed change. All right, I might take that as just let's address David's comments, make sure we're good in PRR and we're good to merge. We'll work on this in 124, but there'll be an alpha in 124, so no commitment. We can fix stuff if folks are unhappy with it.
You can only fix certain things, right? You can't take back like the names that you create and stuff. So yeah,
that's true. You're right. Yeah, we are. By the way, does that the
don't
name
break it, Mo.
I was gonna ask, does the names restriction also apply to the gRPC style APIs? I assume it does, but
yes. Let's just say yes.
I mean, it's a safe bet, but I actually don't know what happens. All right, cool. Thank you, David, for the review. All right, who wants to talk about Cube RBAC proxy?
So this is me. I have a small presentation, just 5 slides, not much.
Yeah, okay, cool. Hold on, I will make you co-host so you can share your screen. Christoph, where are you? Christoph, there you are. All right, sir, you are good to share your screen.
Okay. I hope this works. As a Linux user, always hard to tell. Let me make this.
You can see your screen.
Okay, let me try to make this bigger, like so. Okay, so we wanted to talk about Cube RBAC proxy. It's an amazing piece of software that's in widespread use. The issue why we wanted to talk about is that it's currently in a personal, it's not part of an organization, it's in a personal GitHub account. And we would like to kind of, so as far as I understood properly, Frederick would like to contribute this repository to Kubernetes. And it fits quite well within the SIG-Auth domain because it does authentication and authorization. So for those who don't know it, it runs basically as a sidecar. And it does basically a token review to do the authentication and subject access review to do the authorization. And if everything is fine, it lets the request through to the upstream. So this is a high-level overview that I hopefully, with courtesy from Frederick, copied from his blog. It was an amazing blog entry where he gave an overview of how it works. It's also referenced in the documents. And it's basically what I said, right? So there comes a request, in this case, from Prometheus. Cube RBAC proxy verifies it first with a token review, which makes authentication, then does the authorization and calls the Kubernetes API to verify that everything is okay. There are also 2 cool features, maybe to make it more interesting, is that there's also a static authorization. So then there is no need to go to the Kubernetes API and verify that the user is authorized. And the other cool features also that you can use OIDC provider, so you don't also, so you are able to call the OIDC provider instead of the Kubernetes API. And that's basically it from a high-level view. If I missed something, Sergius or Frederick can add something on top, I guess. Questions?
You have a
Rick,
question.
I believe you muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so a couple of things from chat. So first, let's talk about the 500s. It looks like GitHub is literally returning 500s for absolutely everything right now. So it's not the link's fault. But Jordan also commented that this was previously discussed. I believe this was actually discussed like 2 years ago once before, and we did all agree that we wanted to transfer the repo, but I just didn't pull through with it. And I'm not working on Kubernetes anymore full time. So basically, my understanding is that Serge and sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, want to kind of take this over and do it. From my side, like I'm more than happy to let go of this project. I don't maintain it anymore anyways. The 2 of them already maintain it. So for all I care, they're already the maintainers.
Taylor, you have your hand up? Let you go.
Oh, I'm just, could somebody maybe give me an example of, as a user, why I would deploy this, what I'm accomplishing when I deploy it?
Christoph, you want to take that? Or first?
Sure. So usually, imagine you have a service that you want to protect essentially inside the cluster. You want to ensure that only, for instance, service accounts issued by the cluster should have access to your service Plus, you want to express some notion of authorization. That is, you want to express, okay, I only want service accounts to access this service. Plus, they should have permissions against some expressed cluster role, or any arbitrary role that is configured inside the cluster. When Frederick and me have been working actively on together on this thing, we made the joke this is essentially like a poor man's service mesh sort of thing, right? Where you want to protect your workloads and want to delegate authentication and authorization against API server. The canonical use case, at least for our downstream stuff, is protecting metrics endpoints. That's why Prometheus is present in this diagram. So that's sort of like the canonical use case. And the static authorizers that you saw, and as well the OIDC lookup of verification of tokens, is essentially a means to save your API server from those token review and subject access review requests, if there is need to do so, right? So these are just on top features that were added recently, and yeah, it's still under active development. We're doing regular releases in that regard. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but I have one follow-on question, which is, would you typically make like custom resources and custom verbs in the RBAC, or are you piggybacking on top of existing resources and existing verbs?
It can be either one, right? We even have a lot of precedences where we check things like, do you have get permissions on, or like read permissions on namespaces, for instance, but you can obviously also delegate to custom resources as well. That's no issue, yes. Essentially everything that can be expressed within a cluster role inside Kubernetes.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Is this analogous to HashiCorp Bastion, but at the Kubernetes level?
That's a good question. I would have to look up what Bastion does from HashiCorp. I literally don't know. If there is anyone here that does, please let me know. This is strictly against like for Cube, right? And sort of like has no other association with any other means of integration, and hence also the proposal to contribute it to SIG-Auth.
Yeah, I linked to the meeting. Was it? I didn't look up if it was last March or March 2 years ago. But anyway, there was some discussion there. I think it sounded like there wasn't particular objection to it getting picked up by SIG-Auth at the time. The main reason prompting wanting to bring it in was cluster API and Cube Builder. And so there was a question specifically about that, about why cluster API and Cube Builder weren't using the delegated authorization, which I think would be more in line with what we would recommend. So if you put something that only knows about RBAC in front of a component, that might defy the expectations of the person running the cluster. If they said, well, I have a webhook authorizer, why is this component like only paying attention to RBAC? So as a standalone component, I think David had commented before, like if someone wants to bring it in, he's willing to take a look at it. It seems reasonable, but I don't know that we would recommend this as like the canonical way to protect a service running in the cluster if it only honors a subset of the authorization methods.
So as a quick comment, I've never read the code on this, but that little diagram said it did subject access review. So presumably you can express anything expressible to our authorizer.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
So it might just be poorly named because it's not.
Is it a misnomer? I thought I heard something about like local evaluation.
There is local evaluation for, say, system masters, because we know system masters are always accepted, right?
Okay, but that's not loading all RBAC objects and doing local evaluation of RBAC. Okay, so it's a naming.
Things like, when I've terminated a cert, I have this cert and I know how to terminate it without contacting the server. I know certain.
Can we rename it when we bring it into?
I was just gonna say, I think we had exactly the same discussion 2 years ago, and I said I have no like I have no connection to the
Yeah.
to the name, you know, like
Okay.
for all I care, we can call it Cubeauth proxy or something.
proxy
I
or
don't know.
whatever. Okay.
It's totally fine. And actually is a good idea. I think Cubelet proxy is indeed too specific. Yes, I think renaming is definitely due. Yes.
Okay. So it sounds like we're landing in a similar place to where we landed the last time we talked about it. It doesn't sound like there are particular objections. We might want to tweak the name or tweak the docs to talk about how it integrates and what it actually does. But and I do think we want to check with Cluster API to see if they are using a standalone component when they could be using a baked-in component. But
As an aside, oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask, presumably we want to do some level of API review, code review, to just as we've done in the past for like secret CSI driver and hierarchical namespaces controller. And I had the old meeting notes from March of, I guess, last year when we talked about this, and I said, like, David, it looked like you were willing to champion, but you needed to do it later. Do we have someone, ideally one of the SIG leads that's willing to sort of be our liaison? I think Serg and Christoph are saying that they're going to carry it from the other end, and we'll hopefully land on something this time.
Yeah. The good news is that Serge can bug me this time. But I'd be happy if somebody else had a look as well. It was harder for Frederick to bug me.
I was going to ask, there's the original issue, we went back and forth with this and we never actually really resolved, at least I don't think I remember us resolving this, was like anyone using this proxy you're giving your token to. And before we said we were using it in a system context, and we were like, the people who use this should be part of the infrastructure anyway, and you're basically trusting your distro to do this, and if you do it, it's still on you. Is there any development since then that would change that perception of how we describe this? Because like that's kind of like how you frame who should use this, what it means, the pitch for it would be nice to see.
We have audience capability more widely available now than we did 2 years ago. So
and that was me leading the witness. I was hoping someone would say we've made progress on audience. I just didn't.
For service account tokens, for sure, we have wider audience permissions. I think if you're talking to the API server and the API server is proxying you through to something like this, then you're going to be using TLS header verification. If you're talking directly to this server, it could be reasonable to say like you need a token that is expecting to talk to this audience. I could see letting this be run either way. If it currently will accept a token for the API server audience, then that needs to continue. But
I wasn't implying that it's not useful to have this. It would be more around the framing of how we're like, this is an important thing that if you use this, you need to think about, that maybe like we don't do a great job of nuancing in all the cases. It should be pretty clear, like either it's safe or it's part of the infrastructure, or we have something that makes it not be an issue. One of those three is something we have to communicate.
Yeah, it probably depends on what you're putting it in front of. But if we're going to give an example, we might want to consider the example being to specify the audience and then say, to get a token for this audience, you do this, and then you can use it against this thing, and you're not handing your API token to it. Because a lot of people will copy paste whatever default example we put first.
Jordan, wouldn't it be cool if you could use kubectl to generate a service account token for a particular audience?
That would be cool.
Someone should invent a time machine and go back and write that command yesterday.
And honestly, like this also raises issues of like infrastructure and like TLS. Like we have a whole mechanism for TLS certificate distribution, which also addresses it, whether we want to use audience or not. These are bigger topics. It's just this is a microcosm of the when we originally started the whole token journey, we had the long debate about tokens versus TLS, and 5 years later now, you know, are we actually able to put some of that in practice? And it feels like longer.
Just a small note, the support for token audiences is something that we explicitly added in this component. So you can explicitly say what audiences to verify against. So it's literally baked into the tool as well, just as a side note.
And maybe that's like sufficient. Like, we recommend that you always use an audience for it. And that also drives a use case, which is, hey, is it really easy to get an audience token inside a pod? If only we had some great example of showing how that you could secure a really practical infrastructure component using tokens that don't require you to pre-bake a secret and put it into the Cube API. So like, from that angle, like, that is a very positive forward step.
So yeah, while Serge is right that audiences are supported, I think like the main user that at least in OpenShift this is used for, Prometheus does not support, you know, grabbing an audience token or whatever.
Right, and that's what I meant is like, maybe it should be really easy for a pod to grab an audience token for the explicit purpose of talking to a metrics agent. Like, it only a few people might use it from like the Prometheus style examples. But then you think about all the people who are basically just making up their own authentication authorization mechanism, or worse, running unauthenticated and just hoping that nobody.
It is really easy for a pod to grab an audience specific token. You have a token projection volume and you say, I want it for the metrics audience. So
Right. That's what I mean. Like an example in Cube docs that like really crisply, like, hey, we hear that people have problems securing things on Cube clusters that have infrastructure components that want to transparently look, all of the work SIG-Auth has done over the last 5 years is finally coming home to roost. Look how easy it is.
As a suggestion, I mean, as a suggestion, we could make this as a prime example, like use a projected service account token with an audience, including an example how to configure Cube RBAC proxy with it. We could literally make it in the landing page of the README as well. I'm totally into that.
And that makes the case for it being part of the project stronger, because while there might be scope and complexity, but there's also look, this is just a basic component. It does what it does on the tin. But if Prometheus has a use case for it, maybe there's others who have use cases for it, and we can you know, look for some sort of consensus or community alignment around things like that. Logging has this problem. You know, 17 different types of health checking scraping tools have this problem. The Cubelet kind of has this problem for, like, lots of people raise issues around protected protected health check endpoints. And you know, there's a whole topic of, you know, all the CVEs and stuff that we've had in health checking and admission control. Like, we might have some concrete angles to go tackle here.
One thing I was going to ask about is earlier someone mentioned CA support, like certificate-based auth support. Does the proxy like automatically read the config map in the Cube system and like pull in the CA bundle of the cluster and stuff?
it shouldn't, because that's not a client CA.
Well, there's
there is one for a client CA.
The one that's, yeah, like reading the config map from the API, but not the CA that's mounted in.
Correct. But
yes, that's
there
what
is
I
one that's published.
Okay.
Whether that's the default or not, I don't recall.
Yeah, I meant, yeah, like, yeah, that's what I was kind of curious, right? Like, if you're doing certificate-based auth, how does it figure out? Is it just a config flag that you pass in some CA bundle, or is it auto discover cluster?
That's what it is. The entire intention was that you don't necessarily have to use a particular set of certificates, but that it's entirely configurable.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. I guess the only thing there would be is you do need a particular set of RBAC capability to read that config map. But since it is meant to be sort of dynamic, as in the CA bundle can change, that is some nice capability. I don't know if there's a front proxy use for this, but you know, that is also theoretically possible.
There is, I don't know if we talked about it here, but like there is some work being, there's at least a couple community projects, but that project secrets into other, project common config into workspaces as dynamic volume plugins, like CSI, what's the word for it? The ones that aren't global, or the ones that don't depend on a PV, ephemeral.
Ephemeral.
An ephemeral plugin that, like, starting to talk about standardizing kind of like some of those interface level, you know, could you mount the CA that you expect these workloads to use? Maybe not in core, but as like a reasonable set of extensions. If we have a downward API and we can manage config maps and secrets, it's kind of painful to force people to call the Cube API. Doesn't mean they can't, but there's an argument here, which is the same sorts of, like, I want you to know about trust, and that has a file system representation, and I want that to be updated. That should be a little bit easier in general for components running on Cube.
Cool. So maybe a good AI would be to create a tracking issue and copy in the items that we talked about, like as a checklist, and then tag the folks who are driving it and David, and sound like he wanted one more reviewer. David, if there's a particular area of the review that you want a second set of eyes on, that would be helpful to note, and we can find someone appropriate.
Okay, thanks.
Cool, thank you.
Does anybody have any further comments on this particular topic? I know I need to reshare my screen. All right. Clayton, since you're on the call, are you going to review this cap? Are you going to review the cap?
Yes, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked into a Cubelet issue last night or yesterday. But
Okay, I think tomorrow is the freeze though, right? So like the runway has ended.
If static pods were working right now, this would be my top priority.
Static pods work as long as you like do some deep magic and yeah, obviously don't change anything. You did, just leave it alone. Don't rotate anything. Everything should be static. Okay, cool. So we had some good stuff from this notes. We missed anything? If anyone wants to add more notes, that'd be great. Who put this on the agenda?
I did.
What's up here? What do we got?
Okay, so this is follow on. Late last year, Ted and I presented a cap around, it was kind of wide ranging around certificates in a cluster. The feedback we got on that was extract like the simplest possible piece and bring that back. And this is that, I believe. And it kind of dovetails nicely with the discussion we were just having around distributing trust and root certificates and things like that. Basically, the proposal here is that we give Cubelet the ability to request certificates from arbitrary signers, much in the same way we give Cubelet the ability to request projected service account tokens in a projected volume source at a similar projected volume source that knows how to request certificates from in-cluster signers. It's, I think, pretty simple, but I've been kind of steeped in it for about a month now, so I'm a little biased. Effectively, it kind of works like it says on the tin. Yeah, Cubelet will just generate a key, minimally configurable. Basically, you can choose a couple different RSA profiles, a couple different ECDSA profiles. It will create a CSR in a fixed format addressed to a designated signer, and then the signer needs to understand how to read that CSR and then issue whatever sort of certificate it wants to issue.
I feel like I'm out of the loop now. What's a trust anchor set? I don't remember that API object.
That is a new, it is part of the CAP is proposing a thing called trust anchor sets. You can think of it like root certificates, but every time I say root certificates, my coworker upgrades me and tells me that they are not root certificates because they don't have to be roots. They are trust anchors.
So it's a place to put public keys you can use to verify a particular signer.
Yeah, they're effectively the root certificates for that signer.
Is just not that I have doubts about this particular cap. I haven't read it at all. But that particular trust distribution mechanism, is that something you have a specific small and separate cap for? Or you're just hoping it all goes in at one? I mean, maybe it will. Just that sounds like something people have wanted for a long time.
I'm happy to split that out further. We do have a similar custom resource already that we use inside GKE. That's kind of where the experience is coming from. But if it's separately useful, I'd be happy to break it out into a separate cap, because I think I didn't realize how widely applicable it was, but then the discussion we were just having made me think that maybe it's would be useful. It's effective. It's a glorified config map, but at the cluster scope and with as a separate type, just to give extra handles for RBAC.
Yeah, I've had that request from people many times for how do I verify the CSRs. I don't know, Mo, have you had similar requests?
Yeah, no, that was my initial gut feeling as we hand waved the trust distribution problem of the CSR API, just saying we don't do it. So thus that intrigued me as to, oh, we're doing it now, so I guess let's do that.
Yeah, no, I haven't read the rest of the cap, so all at once might be fine, but that's just a noteworthy thing.
Okay, so here could you give us a high level of like maybe a flow of like I don't know, I'm a pod author, what do I do, and then like what are the actions the system takes on my behalf?
I have a section right for you. I think you're looking at it actually. Let's see. Yeah, I have one section that is the high-level usage flow for ServerTLS, and then I have one section that is the high-level usage flow for mutual TLS. Effectively, you just need to decide, as a pod author, you need to know like which signer you're planning to address the certificates to. So you've installed Cert Manager or something in the cluster. You add a projected volume that designates that signer, says where to put the key and what sort of key to generate, and where to put the issued certificate in your pod file system. And then Cubelet kicks off, creates the CSR, waits for it to be approved. If it's not approved, it blocks your pod from starting up. If it is approved, it writes them out to the file system and then periodically refreshes them based on the lifetime of the issued certificate. And then you need to configure your application to read the key and the certificate off of disk.
How much control does the pod author get over the CSR itself? The bits and
Zero. I think or very little. The idea would be that your signer needs to understand the format that Cubelet is generating, which is detailed at the bottom. It's pretty simple.
Okay.
Basically, the CSR is not intended to be a reflection of the actual certificate that's going to be issued. It's just a way to tie up the public key and some verified pod details that then the signer makes a decision about.
Okay, and so presumably the signer that is handling this needs to at least, like as a for example, would we expect the signer to look at the user information field on the CSR, right, which would be a Cubelet identity, and is it expected to validate that Cubelet, for example, is it like the node authorizer? Is it supposed to validate that pod is running on that Cubelet and the Cubelet should be able to do this?
Yeah, at the very bottom in the CSR format section, I call out a set of security considerations that signers need to check. One of them is, yes, for completeness, they need to either piggyback on the existing node authorizer check or re-implement the node authorizer check. In the system we built like this, we ended up just re-implementing the node authorizer check.
Jordan, can you remind me, there's a node authorizer and related admission plugins gate, do they allow kubelets to make CSRs? Well, yeah, they do for their own flows, but I'm trying to remember, like, could a kubelet today make such a CSR on its own without further changes?
I'm not sure whether he's not here. I'm not sure whether it could or couldn't, but since we know the list of pods, presumably, and I didn't see it here, there was some mapping of pod to the server name you were requesting. I didn't see that mapping in the example Mo had projected. Is it there? To be able to constrain what
So far, I hadn't even gotten to that. That would be authorization of the pod itself. I was more asking for authorization of the kubelet to create and approve specific CSRs.
The Bootstrap signer has the ability to create a CSR for itself, and then they all have the ability to renew because the renewal is related to who they are. It's not quite the same as general purpose CSR creation, because the Bootstrap credential may actually isn't used once the kubelet takes over, unless somebody changed something and I missed it in the last year. But so it's not quite general, but it's not a far step from it. Like, you could argue the kubelet, once the kubelet's renewing, its responsibilities are to renew its own CSRs, but
I don't know that I would say a general CSR is a good idea, but if we have a specific type and one that we can say, yes, the CSR being requested here is related to the pods that are located, there's a strong,
well,
like, you could build that.
I mean, ultimately, the authorizer is checking that you have permission to do things related to your role. That's probably one of the differences here, actually, between something that's like an entry plugin and my question about doing this with an inline volume plugin is that, in theory, the node authorizer, which is not extensible, could say, and yes, the kubelet is allowed to do CSRs for this specific reason, however that's framed. But it is a little, I mean, the node authorizer is not extensible to the level that would allow an out of tree approach to approximate this today.
It's not really the CSR that we care about authorizing, right? It's more the approval.
Yeah, that's what I was. So I had actually not thought about whether or not Cubelet has the ability to create these CSRs today. But like Tim says, the more important security consideration here is that approvers and signers should not be willy-nilly. Like, they need to be very clear that they are approving a certificate for a pod that was requested by a kubelet that has a reason to be requesting stuff for that pod.
Right. And I only drew that connection just because effectively we're drawing on the kubelet's root of trust to establish a further root of trust. And that's like, and I didn't see it explicitly called out, but I just wanted to double check that assumption.
Yeah, I'm assuming that Cubelet kind of has unrestricted ability to create these CSRs. Maybe there's a node authorizer check that says, hey, you need to be requesting CSRs for that represent only pods that you're running. But that would require looking deep inside the CSR object itself at authorization time.
But as a
node
property,
authorizer does that.
Yeah, that's kind of there's a lot of advantages. I think I was going exactly the same spot you were, David. Why don't you continue? Sorry.
Yeah, like the node authorizer does that in mission. It has access to the entire resource and can say, this particular piece lets me know that this is related to it.
This kubelet is allowed to request this CSR because this pod is on it that requests this service account, which would be was kind of what I meant by inheriting the chain of trust. Like, the kubelet is authorized to grant permissions that is a subordinate to itself. And then I guess the question is the trust anchor a crossover to a different trust domain as well? Because there's a difference between a kubelet saying that it is requesting this on its behalf and that's okay, and how do I know that this trust anchor, the kubelet, is allowed to do this?
I think the check has to be done in both places then. Node authorizer saying that Cubelet is allowed to create the CSR, and then the signer or the approver component of the signer needs to do whatever security checks it feels are necessary. including a repeat of the node authorizer check, probably.
I'm not sure about the first one or the value of the first one. We already have the create of from the CSR API is not sensitive. And I think like a model that would be sort of probably fine today would be for a node for one of these signers or CSR approvers to just issue a subject access review for create token for the pod or something. That would be a good approximation. But yeah, I don't think create is particularly sensitive. And
I mean,
you know,
if someone compromises a node and then spams CSRs and destroys the whole cluster, that's mostly what I'm thinking about here.
We have no prevention of that today. So
right, we should have prevention of that today. I guess that's what I'm saying. I'm not, I wouldn't make this. I don't think that this necessarily has to take on the responsibility for going and doing that, but in terms of pushing in the right direction. But you're right, Mike. And actually, like if the fundamental permission here is that the kubelet is allowed to impersonate the service account through a pod, and we don't talk in those terms. And I'm not even arguing. We've had the argument about whether the kubelet should actually have the permission allowed to impersonate a given service account in a context, whether that's RBAC modeled or not. But the service account token is also doing the same thing, which is you're allowed to impersonate or tell another system that as the kubelet, you are going to give another component a token, and you should trust the kubelet to do that, as you're saying, I think.
I was going to go back to David's point. I think, David, you had mentioned, so this conversation we just had covers the authorization of the kubelet to create / approve these and the signer's valid verification of that before doing this extra signing and updating the certificate. I think, David, you had asked about the other side, which is the pod itself requesting the use of a particular signer and common name. Yes.
I'm not entirely clear on what would be included in the certificate that we requested to get signed. And maybe that's just like free form, like you've got to point it at some file that the pod, I guess it can't be a file from the pod.
So actually, there is no control over the form, like the pod author has no control over the format of the CSR. My thinking was the CSR is just a vehicle for the signer / approver to be aware, to know what public key to issue the certificate against, the pod's public key, and then have some details about the requesting pod and service account that are verified by Cubelet.
Okay, so then I guess for ServerTLS, I'd be interested in what this certificate looks like.
So I think
the signer has to make that distinction.
Yeah, the signer just makes up whatever the signer wants, right? Like the signer gets to decide.
Huh.
So the signer would be responsible for like noticing that this pod is participating in a Kubernetes service with a certain annotation or with a certain DNS name, and figuring out which of those names it wants to put in the issued certificate.
I mean, this is interesting. It bypasses the authorization problem by just saying that you just can't ask for anything. We just have trusted metadata flowing through, and gotta make sure in my head that trust works out right.
It's kind of an interesting, like comparing this to the previous discussion of like audience. It's effectively the CA trust is a proxy for who the audience is and the use, just like audience is a proxy for a human defined thing. It's a little bit of physical pain that there's no mapping between those concepts, but I don't know that it's our job to. And if like we were talking about like building blocks, there are some elements of this that nothing prevents potentially adding on additional metadata in the future if such a use case emerged. And you could argue that this looks a little bit like the simplest possible flow for granting a pod a certificate without Cube being opinionated about what that certificate is for, which has other nice properties, because you can always build a more general thing on top.
So
one open question I have about this is whether or not, so we have this long section on CSR format, and it's not clear to me that any of this data actually needs to be inside an X509 CSR. It could just be on the Kubernetes CSR object. But I haven't thought through the, like, maybe security implications of that.
It's weird because it's a little bit like the actual certificate request carrying it opens some door for interop with complex signing implementations. And we all know how popular complex signing implementations have been and how successful they are. And so there's kind of a, I kind of have this, reading this, I was like, oh, that's good. These are all things that I would want to see there, even if they're never used. But I think there might be a counter argument, which is, it's possible that there shouldn't. Maybe they're just associated with a UID of a CSR, and we guarantee the immutability of them.
So
see trade-offs.
A question related to this. So I've had this use case in the past, but I don't know if others have, where I have like a privileged actor that I want to create CSRs using for a less privileged actor, but I don't want the less privileged actor to like control any of the CSR fields, right? I basically just want the public key of the less privileged actor. And it's, the CSR API is weird in the sense that I actually need a fully signed CSR object to, you know, get through the whole flow. Presumably, you know, so like what's missing there today is the fact that you can't specify basically the data that you get through the CSR and the public key separately, right? Like from what I've understood, that the security properties of a CSR are kind of not necessarily based in the threat model that I necessarily understand. That like the idea is, you know, you're asserting that the actor who you're signing the CSR for has the private key and they've signed over this, but you don't necessarily need that, right? In the sense of, yes, someone could have tricked you into using their private key, I guess, and signing a different CSR in accident, but I'm not really sure what it's guarding against. Yeah.
I think you're right that in this case, we don't gain anything by having these like pod UID, pod name signed by the key, because they're like extra extra metadata that we only trust because we know they come from Cubelet, not from the pod.
And the Cubelet's the one creating the CSR in this case. So there is a little bit of, it's funny because the world would be a better place if everything came with well-formatted and extensive metadata that allowed you to use it in situ without having to build a more complicated integration. So like sometimes if you've got a place to put the metadata and it doesn't hurt, I usually would tend to be somewhat judicious or be generous in terms of the metadata we set, because as long as we can't come up with a use case like as you're asserting, which is, this is wrong, who am I trusting to do this?
I think the bit that this prevents is, so the problem I had with the flow that exists today is I could not, in this case, if I understood correctly, the private key that's associated with the certificate is generated by the kubelet on behalf of the pod. It cannot be, the pod can't instead generate its own private key somewhere else and just provide the public key, right? It cannot do
Correct,
that,
yeah.
right? And that was the bit that I was trying to build, which is I have an unprivileged actor that has its own private key. I would just like to take its public key and use the CSR API and give it a signed assertion without ever having to hold its private key myself, right? And that was the bit that bugged me out.
Yeah, it's kind of a fundamental difference in scenario too. Like this is extending the kubelet's chain of trust the same in a compatible way to, or comparable way to service account token. I guess maybe another question here is, and that triggered it, Mo, and I don't want to prevent your question from being answered. One of the other things that asks is there a scenario where this is something that other elements within the kubelet would like to use a private key that represents the pod that the pod does not have access to? So we have a few cases and examples where like service account token, like a sidecar might want it, or an integration running on the node might want it, that we haven't really developed. So like maybe the other ask here would be like a couple of kind of use cases that you intend, just to make sure that we can frame that in the right case. But if there has been any thinking about whether this is a more general thing for other kubelet integrations, volume plugins, or something else to leverage, whether any of those things apply. Like this shouldn't be visible to the container necessarily, or to the pod author.
It should be a projected volume, and it can be mounted or not mounted to specific containers as necessary. I imagine that an Istio scenario, you would mount it to the Istio container, this Istio sidecar, and you wouldn't mount it to the direct container that you're running.
I think what Clayton may be referring to is like, I've written a CSI driver that needs a certificate that asserts a pod identity, but I don't want the pod to have access to that certificate. Am I reading you right?
And to the point though, actually, the way that Istio is designed is broken, because it's putting highly privileged trusted things as a sidecar, and then all the other containers, it's very easy to break that security boundary.
Right.
So the CSI example, I'm sorry.
I see. Yes.
And so I was just thinking like, a CSI plugin or an Istio plugin implemented at the infrastructure level that gave the container something that allowed it to say who it was, but it never actually saw that private key. I didn't know if that was something that was, you're thinking in, maybe this is a use case canvassing thing that might help.
You could implement instead a PKCS11 object in the kubelet.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know some of the original goals for Istio, and honestly, the problems people have with like Istio and security kind of come down to the sidecar is useful, but it's not very secure, and it certainly comes with a lot of complexity that works fine when your cluster is, only one tenant or one user. So there's just something I was coming up. So a set of use cases in the doc would be great, and then maybe like if we could poke a little bit at who else might want to use this private key and what are the use cases, and are there any implications on the design? I didn't know what your guys' use cases were, so.
Varied.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say my primary use case that I think about is MTLS, but I made some effort to make sure that the proposal also works for people who want serving certificates.
And Michael Telfin's private pull tokens, right? Like there's an argument that the kubelet is actually doing the pulling on a user's behalf. And so there is a shortcut of that indirection that might be useful with private keys for external registries, or for somebody needs to prove the kubelet would ideally like to have a credential that, if exposed, is minimally broad. If it has to give a credential like a token to someone, it wants to scope it. Private keys are a little bit easier, so it may not be necessary. Just something also like crosses over. The private key does have advantages over the service account token in terms of exposure, and keeping the private key out of the pod altogether has some interesting, it certainly touches on other things that make the private key truly private.
Google, for production, inside Google Prod, there's some thought going around ways to keep private keys away from workloads, and instead have a model similar to what we do today with our weird homegrown TLS equivalent called LOS, where you are writing a job and you need to make a encrypted connection to someone else, but you don't have the private key. Instead, you send a message to a local sidecar, node level sidecar that is keeping all your keys in an HSM, and it does the TLS connection setup, and then hands you back an initialized connection through magic.
Yeah,
it's much harder to think about how to. Oh, thank you, Mike. I did not realize that was public now. It's called S2A.
Yeah.
As Mike
I've
said.
certainly seen a number of those, and that's partially why I'm probing here whether there's other types of things that we could, like laying the foundation here, and then also being able to go and look at this would dramatically up level security of most workloads. Most people are just really bad at setting up TLS certs anyway. So I'll add a few more comments to the doc. Thank you, though.
Okay.
We only have like a minute left, and probably don't have too much time for discussion. So this does seem like a really good topic to hear. Which piece of this are you wanting to tackle? Like, I know, so David had mentioned trying to pull out the CA distribution problem, basically. That probably is smaller, though I don't know how contentious. I'm sure folks have opinions on how they want to get their roots. Or
maybe we give people 2 weeks to read what was here and then come back and talk about it again next week. This is the first I saw this. I don't know if other people had seen it before.
No, I had looked at the agenda last night. So
yeah, I do think that the action item to break out the trust and make that accessible, as Mike suggested, as a generalized, you could use this to replace your CA serves. And OpenShift has already implemented something of the sort. I think that's a worthwhile action item for us to take too.
I wouldn't mind if you wanted to wait for initial comments first, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's
okay, then I'll put it on the agenda for next time. And
let's do it. Thanks, y'all. So we'll see y'all in 2 weeks.
all right.